answer a few questions. I was just next door. We just got a new suite to expand our sour house essentially over to a suite next door. Unfortunately, not right next door. It is there's one suite in between us, so hopefully we can eventually squeeze them out. But so I was over there painting and stuff today. We're trying to get everything ready so we can get like 80, almost 80, mostly wine barrels over into our new space and get all of Mike's sour crap out of here so we can have our clean stuff in here.
That's awesome. Very cool stuff. Yeah, it's I can only imagine all the untold tasks of being a owner operator of a brewery, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So I know we kind of discussed the format of this. Now you said a little bit about just like a round robin questions. Any kind of desire of what direction to take? I mean, anything you wanted to share with us, maybe something new you guys are working on or new techniques or anything before we kick off some of the QA aspects?
New, I mean, honestly, there's always something new, when it comes to Mike and I trying to brew here. We're always trying to still improve things, get better, try to prove each other wrong all the time. We're always good at doing that. Honestly, not a whole lot new. I guess one thing new, because I just caught my eye in the background there. Mike bought that that Sonic thing there. Do you see I'm pointing at?
Oh yeah.
Sonic thing. So he's been trying to, we're experimenting now with dosing like some of those extracts, those incognitos, into some water, and then using an emulsifier and really just hitting it with that to try to get it into solution before we add it to our whirlpool kettle. So always doing kind of weird stuff like that. Yeah, just it's always tough to know. We might work with a local. Let's see, his name is escaping me right now. Dr. John Paul May. So he's in Virginia, works for Hopsteiner. He might work with us to see if actually test some of our beers to see if things like that are actually getting more hop compounds into the beer or not. But we're always. It seems like you could always do one more thing a little better. So we're always trying that.
That's the knack though, right? That's what keeps things going, of kind of the Kaizen of it, right? I know I'm never completely happy with anything I've ever made in my life. And probably the same can be said for a lot of other folks in here. So totally resonates with me.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So kind of tee some things up. We kind of took a little bit of a list of some folks who had some questions. So I guess first up, we'll turn over to Mr. Tony Konomu.
Hey Scott, how are you? Love the book, by the way. It was great read. I actually employed a lot of the techniques that you and I like the summary at the end where you make a lot of recommendations on sort of the key takeaways of the sections. And I tried a couple of the techniques, and the one that sort of caught me a little bit by surprise is the whirlpool temperatures, right? So and the duration, right? So I think you're recommending typically on the high side, maybe 195 in the 190s. And I tend to typically prefer maybe a little bit lower. Can you maybe go into a little bit more detail as to, what different profiles on whirlpool temps and durations and what kind of effects it can have on the final effect on the beer?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you liked the key findings at the end. I had Brian Roth from Good Beer Hunting kind of read through it first, and he's like, man, there's so much crap in these chapters. I get done and I'm like, I don't know what I just read. You gotta summarize this stuff or do something. Yeah, so whirlpool temperatures, I've been all over the place on those. I can tell you right now, we pretty much settled in here at about 180 degrees for most of our whirlpool editions. We'll go, if we want as much bitterness, I think we'll drop it to about 150, 160, and then we'll do about a half an hour whirlpool. And that's just generally if we're doing like a lower ABV beer, or say we're trying to do more of like a, milkshakey IPA or something where you just want lots of flavor and want that bitterness restrained, then we'll drop it even lower. So that's when we're around 150. But there's just, some of the science that I looked at in the book suggests that if you're whirlpooling at, 200 degrees or warmer, you're probably losing some volatile aromatics. A lot of those are probably ones you'd lose anyways in the boil. I mean, a lot of these hop compounds are the hydrocarbons that are the most volatile, and they're, if you're adding them during the boil, they're almost leaving your kettle almost immediately. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because those are the ones, in my opinion, that are a little greener. You kind of want to push those out anyways, but just through the process of fermentation, you're probably going to lose that class of hop compounds regardless. So, if you're the one study I always kind of point to suggested that you're getting kind of, the most, they found the highest amount of hop compounds in, specifically the monoterpene alcohols, which is kind of what we're after in hoppy beers. So this is like the linalool and geranials. They got a higher amount of those when they were around 180, I believe it was. And it's the sensory panels that they had, also kind of like these more, they're fruitier. And if they went too cold, they actually, I think it got a little herbal. And if they went hotter, it changed. But I will say that I think, those results in that study would probably alter quite a bit if they changed the hop variety that was used. I think that plays a big part of that. For example, I don't know if you guys have used Sabro at all. Sabro is just one of those hops where it's like, if it's in a beer, like, man, I can tell right away. Like, it's just so dominant. That might be one, if I was whirlpooling, I might throw in at 210 degrees, just because I want to push some of those rough edges off of a hop like that. And so that's, I think it always kind of depends on the beer. It depends on the hops that you're using and kind of your goal. But in general, yeah, we're about 180 for most of our beers, and be happy to talk more about, what hops we use on the hot side. That's kind of a big obsession of ours, probably mostly mine, but hopefully that answers a little bit of your question.
Yeah, that actually answers the question. I'm actually glad that we sort of settled at the same temperature. I sort of settled at the 180, but I only do 10 minutes, but 30 minutes, you think it's not, pulling too much bitterness into the beer? Or does it matter whether it's 10 or 30, or what are some of the effects of duration?
I always go back and forth on that, because in a lot of ways, I mean, if you just look at some of the studies that look at dry hopping and extraction, I mean, you get a pretty good extraction of dry hops cold and quickly. So if you kind of look at the other end of that, I bet you're getting extraction of your hop compounds in the kettle like pretty even faster, So I go back and forth. I think once your hops kind of settle out in the bottom of your kettle, I don't know if they're really doing a whole lot of good for you. And it's the same kind of concept when they're sitting in the bottom of your fermenter. I don't think they're kind of done at that point. And so I'd say 15 minutes, especially on the homebrew scale, if you're doing, 5, 10, 15 gallon batches is probably good. I'd imagine you get a little better extraction efficiency on those smaller scales. Yeah, I'd say it depends on the bitterness, but I'm also not too afraid of bitterness when it comes to IPAs, especially hazy IPAs. I think the general idea is, of course, everyone's trying to make a beer that's, hazy, soft, not very bitter, and full of flavor. But I think the one thing most brewers do, and maybe this is more my personal experience or preference, is they leave too many hops out of the hot side. And the result is, I don't know if you've had any hazy IPAs that are just super aggressive, super raw. It's more green than it is fruit flavors. It's more vegetal than it is, tropical. And that's just something I don't really care for. And I think part of that is, if you are using, let's say you're putting hardly any hops at all on the hot side, and then you're just dry hopping at like 6-7 pounds per barrel, which are let's say 15 ounces in a 5 gallon batch or something. I think you're throwing in all these hop acids like humulones that are actually extracted during the dry hop cold that actually add bitterness to a beer. You're extracting polyphenols, but they're not balanced by any other compounds. I mean, when you're adding, getting IBUs from the hot side, even from your whirlpool hops, that's actually, those IBUs are pulled out during dry hopping in large part. So The vegetal material and hops themselves can actually pull out and strip hot side isomerized alpha acid. So, you know, so in my mind, it's like, okay, I'm going to lose some of these. They're going to be replaced by some humulones from the dry hop that are a little less bitter. But if it's all that green, if it's all that cold side, it's just way too green for me. So that's why I like to try to pack in as much as I can on the hot side. So loading up a whirlpool, I'm not too afraid of IBUs for the most part, because you're going to lose some of those through fermentation. You're going to lose some to trub. You're going to lose some to the vegetal material and hops when you're dry hopping. But you're going to also, you know, retain some of those hop oils that you're after for that's that saturated hop flavor base that I think is important to, you know, a good balanced IPA. So so when it comes to IBUs, I maybe I should be a little more concerned than I am, but that's kind of where I'm at, is where I'd rather my focus be on getting hop oils, fruity, you know, the fruitier hop oils into the kettle for yeast interaction and just for overall flavor to kind of help balance IPAs.
Good
Okay,
stuff.
great.
Cool. Was that what you had, Tony?
Yeah, I have some more, but I'll others to go. I know.
Cool. Yeah,
everyone wants to
we'll
chop
make
at the
her
bit.
around then. Cool. So we'll turn it over to another Dan in the group, Mr. Daniel Coiro.
Hey, Scott. I just want to say thanks for taking your time out, and congratulations on Sapwood and everything.
Thanks.
So yeah, read the book, fantastic. One of the parts that really struck out to me was, you know, you interviewing a whole bunch of other breweries and then talking about your process, which I was really impressed that you know, went in such great detail. What I really enjoyed was the fact that you incorporated, you know, a lot of the science throughout the chapters into your process. And I wanted to know if any of those things kind of variably change based off of the concept of the beer that you want to produce. So based on the idea from the beginning to the end, do you change that process at all, or have you augmented that process at all?
Yeah, I mean, we have changed. You know, I should go back and look exactly what our process was at the time, but yeah, going around and interviewing, you know, some of my favorite brewers before that was, you know, a little selfish in a way, because I was just a home brewer and I was writing the book, but I was also like, I'm a little afraid I don't know what to do on the big scale, and so I just kind of stole everyone's secrets and incorporated that in as we started. But we've changed quite a few things. I think one of the biggest things we just changed process-wise is how we agitate our dry hops. That's one of those things that, you know, for a while we just weren't getting the kind of oomph that we expected from them. And I think the one area where it was pretty obvious, and we probably should have caught it earlier, is if we were taking a sample from the, you know, while you're dry hopping your beer and you pull a sample, it should be pretty aggressive. It should be raw. You should see, you know, hop debris in your glass. And we weren't seeing that. And so, you know, I think what was happening is a lot of our hops were just kind of settling out. And there's, you know, probably reasons why, you know, we dry hop a little cooler than probably most breweries. But, and so, you know, we were doing these quick burps from the bottom of our cone. So essentially we would hook up CO2 through the bottom of our cone, and we would hit it with like, you know, 20, 30 PSI, but we were just doing these like quick short bursts. We were thinking that would just kind of like push it up. But at the same time, we had quite a bit of head pressure on those tanks. And I think what was happening is we're just kind of creating this like, you know, one little avenue of CO2 going up, and it really wasn't agitating the hops much. So we've moved to doing about, you know, a full minute of 30 PSI blast at the bottom of our cone, just opening up and just letting it go. And you can put your ear to the side of that cone and just hear the, you know, just hearing it go crazy. And then you pull a quick sample from the port, and it's totally undrinkable. There's so much hops in there, but that's what you want while you're dry hopping. If those hops are sitting in the bottom of your cone, you know, they're kind of they're a waste for you at that point. You need them up into the beer. So, you know, we're doing that, you know, once a day for about 2 or 3 days, and then we'll drop those dry hops out and then do another charge and do the same thing. as a home brewer, I think, I've noticed even on some of our, so I don't really homebrew anymore, but I'm always stealing wort from our big tanks into Mike and I's homebrew gear. So say we knock out, 300, 600 gallons of wort before we pitch yeast. I just run some of that beer off into separate homebrew tanks, and then I can play with different yeast or play with different, dry hopping or whatever. But as it relates to agitating those homebrew size batches, I found that you can essentially, if you can dry hop under pressure, I just kind of shake the tank, because if you have pressure on it, I think you're probably fine. It's probably a little harder if it's like in a bucket or something, but even a carboy, I think if you swirl it, you get those hops back up, and so I'd say once a day or something would probably be enough to do that. But agitating and not agitating, I think makes a big deal. And I think maybe not so much, I've talked to some of the bigger breweries lately, because John Palmer asked me to write a best practices guide on dry hopping, which I was a little hesitant to do, but John Palmer's never talked to me before. So I was like, all right, man, I'll do it for you. And so that's for the Master Brewers publication. But so because of that, I was asking some other brewers, how they agitop, and agitate, and if they think it's important. And some of the ones that are doing IPAs on like these massive tanks, they're not doing any burping at all, which was amazing to me. But I guess I just kind of theorized that those giant tanks, the amount of time it takes those hops to kind of percolate through down that tank into the wort, they're probably just getting extracted on their way down, and then they all have centrifuges and they just speed through the process. But so I guess that's a super long-winded answer to say one new thing that we have tried process-wise.
Cool.
Scott, I got a quick question. Sorry to jump in, but do you drop the trube before you do that whole burping process, or you just let it ride and just let it get kicked back up?
Yeah, so generally we'll ferment out. Occasionally we'll do mid-fermentation dry hopping. Mike and I were doing that more as home brewers, but when it comes to harvesting and repitching yeast, it's just not as practical. So for the most part, we're not doing that unless we're not going to harvest that yeast, or we want to look for different flavors from those hops. So generally we'll let fermentation finish. We'll drop to about 58 or 56 degrees for about a day or two, and that's when we'll harvest the yeast. We'll drop the trube, harvest yeast, and then we will, all the yeast that we don't harvest, we then get out to, and that's when we'll dry hop. So we're trying to dry hop pretty much on as clean a beer as we can. I guess in a lot of ways, I just don't like the idea of dead yeast hanging around in that beer very long. That could cause some off flavors, as well as yeast can interact with some hop compounds and kind of pull them, potentially pull them out. And so, that's kind of why we're doing that. And it also just seems like we're on this constant, like we're always adding a whole bunch of stuff to beer and then day by day trying to get it back out. So that's kind of the game here. For example, like when we're dry hopping, we're done dry hopping and we'll probably do it in 2 stages. We unit tank most of our beers. So that wasn't something we did early on, but it just helps keeps dissolved oxygen numbers down, just because you're not having to transfer from tank to tank, and you can always pick up oxygen from hoses. And granted, you try to purge everything as well as you can, but so we've just moved to unit tanking, and we found that when we're just we drop from like 50 to like 45 over one day, we drop all those hops out, and then we drop another 5 degrees the next day, drop all those hops out. And each step, it just seems like it helps encourage everything out of that tank. And so we're always just trying to clear our beer up, not really clear our beer up, but we're trying to get crap out of there, just to have a cleaner experience for people that buy it. But I guess that's probably only really I mean, that's, you know, unless you have like those conical fermenters at home, I guess that's probably not as practical as information for you. But I know a lot of those spike conicals and stuff now are pretty nice, and we have a 15-gallon one here that we play with. So so some of that might apply. It depends on your setup.
Oh yeah, they're pretty popular around this group.
Nice.
Yeah, that's what I have. So thank you very much for
Still
that
waiting
answer.
for mine.
It's a hotly debated topic. Do you need a conical or just go with a cardboard?
That's it. Yeah, that's the way to do
I
it.
had a similar question to Jason, because I don't have a conical, and do you recommend sort of doing that in the secondary to swirl around the dry hops? Because right now I just do the dry hops with the yeast in there.
Do you ever dry hop in a second vessel or a keg?
Not really, but I could. That could be a technique change. So would the recommend? So you definitely recommend not dry hopping with the yeast together.
You certainly can. I mean, I think you'd still get good results. I can just say kind of what I would do is I would ferment out in one of those big mouth bubblers, and then I would I would do a closed. Well, first I would add my dry hops to a keg loose, and I had this filter that went over my keg dip tube. So I'd throw my hops in loose. I would probably add about 0.2 grams of metabisulfite if you guys are okay with adding something like that. I think that can really help scavenge some oxygen. And every little bit helps when it comes to hazy IPAs because they can go downhill, you know, pretty fast. So I would add that to a keg, close the keg up, and then run CO2 through that keg with the pressure relief valve open. And so I'm trying to push CO2 through the dip tube. So CO2 is entering my keg from the bottom, coming out through the top, coming out through the pressure relief valve, and I just let it go for about a minute or so. And then I bring that keg up to 15 PSI and blast it down to 0 about 10 times. That's just purging and purging that vessel. It's also purging, you know, kind of the hops itself. And then I would do a closed transfer from my big mouth bubbler into the keg. And then that's kind of how I would dry hop. So closed transfers, you know, everything's just kind of hooked to each other. So I'm sure you probably already, you understand or are probably already doing that, but so that's kind of how I would do it at home. And I still do some of that here. Cause then you're dry hopping under pressure too. That's another benefit. You get those, you get the dry hops extracting, but you have some top pressure on. So, you know, if you're swirling that keg, you know, hopefully that head pressure is keeping some of those volatiles in solution. So you can just, and then you don't have to worry about it as much. You can just pick up your keg and swirl it around because, you know, you have 5 or 10 PSI on it.
In that situation, would you worry about transferring it off of the dry hop to a clean keg at some point, or you just serve it right from there and drink it quick enough that it doesn't pull vegetal or any other flavors you weren't desiring?
I now transfer off after about 3 or 4 days into another keg, doing the same kind of purge system to it. But I realize that can kind of be a pain. As a home brewer, a lot of times I'd leave those hops in. I think they just kind of settle out and don't do a whole lot for you after a while. But there is a little research that suggests that the longer those hops sit, the worse that could, that could impact head retention. That could maybe start pulling some more polyphenols and stuff. But none of those tests are really done at 35 degrees. So I could, I've done it both ways. As a home brewer, often I would just leave it in there just because I didn't want to clean and purge a whole nother keg. But now there's kegs always around and it's a little easier. So, honestly, I would, if you're willing to try it both ways and see if you can tell the difference.
I found, like, for me, it's been like 2 weeks as about the sweet spot where it's when I've done hopping in kegs where things start to go funky. So if you're drinking it within 2 weeks, it's fine. But that's just been me personally.
Yeah. And once you start getting towards the end of that keg, you're going to start really pulling in some of that crap that's settled out, and unless your dip tube is cut or something, even if your dip tube is cut, you're probably still going to get some hop debris in those final, 3 pours or whatever. But
You got to flip your kegs.
We all need to go buy more kegs.
That's it.
Don't tell my wife that. She will not agree with you.
I have to just get them. You have to tell her. Just get them. That's your first.
I've always had these. If they're used, she doesn't know how old they are,
Yeah,
right?
you lost count, not me.
put the same sticker on each keg in the same spot. It'll just look the same.
That's it. She'll never know the difference.
Yep.
Cool. So we'll pass it over to Tommy D, who I think had some questions to raise.
Yeah. So definitely, yeah. And thanks again for all the contributions you've made. I've read some of your articles, and I think either Zymergy or BOIO. I always forget which is which, but and I've definitely followed a lot of the advice. Also, just a quick plug for our club. I have to say, like, around this virtual table, you've got probably the best non-professional IPA makers in the state.
Whoa.
Thanks,
Tommy.
and some professional ones too. No, I mean, I think we have a pretty good group here of these type of beers. I think overall, so we're pretty passionate about coffee beers. One question kind of, as Tony was saying, and a lot of guys also, when we do comps, and some people judge the New England category in home brewing, there's usually like 4 or 5 beers that hold up, and then the others sort of go gray and oxidize and sort of fall apart, unfortunately, by the time they get to the comp. And I know some of the guys who've placed well, we tend to actually dry hop pretty much during biotransformation. And then me personally, because all of the steps you outline, I agree with 100%, but I'm lazy. I just don't want to do them. So I don't know. I just kind of asked the question the other way. How do you feel like at the homebrew scale, just throwing in your dry hops all at, let's say, day 2 or day 3, especially if you're using like a Nottingham yeast or your typical hazy yeast, and just locking it down? Like, for me, I still stick in glass carboys, but I'm super careful when I'm doing closed CO2 transfers from there on in, so that I'm never really opening that. I mean, how do you feel about that strategy, or do you think it's worth taking those extra steps to give it I guess I'll call it a cleaner later dry hop?
Yeah, I mean, whenever you're adding hops with active fermentation, I think you're kind of altering the result from that particular variety a little bit. You're going to be pushing out some of those compounds through CO2. That's kind of why if you ever open up one of I assume you have like a chamber of some sort or something, and if you open up that door while you do an active fermentation dry hopping, it smells a little too good. Like, you kind of want that to be in your beer and not being pushed out. But maybe you compensate by dry hopping at a little higher rate or something. I do see a huge benefit in the added risk of the potential to not add oxygen probably can outweigh a lot. The timing of your dry hops, or the amount that you're dry hopping, and honestly, any step throughout the process, if you're getting oxygen in, it's just going to go downhill. So I guess, it really kind of depends what you're looking for. I think there is a difference. For example, if I dry hop a Citro mid fermentation or after, I think I get a different character from each. So I mean, maybe you could do a little of both if you're you're going to have to go and do a keg anyways, right? So, I mean, you could do, 80% of your dry hops in your fermenter, and then, just do a small little keg dry hop and, put them in a bag or something, just to give you a little bit more of that, like, raw, fresh, out of the bag character, just as like a top note to the base that you've kind of already got. Maybe something like that might be a good sort of middle ground.
I'm definitely doing an experiment now. We definitely split a batch. And then I had just a quick question on rate. So dry hop rate, I'm pretty sure it's the kind of got me to realizing, okay, there's a limit to the madness. And I think if I do my math, converting it to sort of pounds per barrel, I think like 3 to 4 pounds per barrel, of course, at a 5-gallon batch. But and what are your thoughts about that rate? Like, how much higher can you really go to homebrew scale before everything just gets green and vegetal and you're just wasting money?
Yeah, that's a pretty good rate in terms of, like, most of our IPAs and double IPAs here about 4 pounds per barrel. We'll do, maybe 22 or 2 pounds per barrel if it's like a really low alcohol beer. But for most of the 5-gallon batches that I do on the side here, just to experiment, I'm generally around 8 to 10 ounces.
Yeah.
And I think if you're,
by the way, you save us all a lot of money. Getting out of hand.
I think if you're doing a lot of like day one dry hopping, you might need a little bit more. And I also think if you're, adding a lot of, it seems counterintuitive, but if you're adding more hops in the whirlpool, I think you can get away with a little bit more on the cold side. You're, like I was mentioning earlier, you're pulling a lot of those isomerized alpha acids out. You're kind of replacing them with different compounds, and you're just building a more complex beer at that point. So I'd say that, your rate sounds pretty good to me.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Good stuff. We'll pass this over to Maddie P., one of our resident homebrewers turned pro brewers.
Nice.
Hello.
Living the dream.
From the brewery.
Nice.
Where I live.
Good a life. You should be home.
I work 2 jobs, so
He also lives about 6 minutes away
Yeah, I
from the
can-
brewery, so
yeah,
he can walk home.
yeah, 6 minutes walking. I could jump home. It's a passion project. So my question definitely gets more into the chemistry of dry hopping and the pH aspect of it, and how hop character is affected by pH, particularly the final pH of a beer. One of the things we do here is we'll dry hop with 1 point left to let the yeast buffer the wort back down to more like a 4, 4, 4, 5. So when you're doing your cold side hopping, especially when you're dropping out the yeast, what kind of pH are you experiencing, and have you seen an effect based off of final pH?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like extraction at different pHs, I think unless you're really low, I think low pH, almost like an acid extraction can happen. But we don't pay attention. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, but we don't pay a whole lot of attention to our pH during the dry hop. We are more concerned about trying to massage that pH through the process to try to get it where we want it at the end, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Just a real quick, where this question spawned from was some of us were talking the other night, and we had that same exact conversation about how the beginning of when you mash in is when you're thinking about your final pH and how that affects.
Yeah, and I think, so many variables can alter that. I mean, like different yeast strains will draw you down to different pHs and all that. But if you're using the same one, you can kind of, using the same yeast strain, that is, you can kind of play with some variables to see where it gets you. But for the most part here, we're in a hoppy IPA, for example, probably like a 5.2 pH in the mash is where we're targeting. We have a direct fire system, which means we, pick up a little more color than I'd probably prefer just from, just that direct heat. And so we'll add phosphoric acid to the kettle before we even turn on the flame. So we're dropping our kettle pH before we even boil, and that's you should get a little less color that way. That's partly why we do it, but also it drops our pH post boil to about 4.8, 4.9. And that's just, when you're dry hopping at such heavy rates, of course, dry hopping raises the pH of beer. And so, in my test where I've just done like little acid drops in IPAs post fermentation just to alter the pH and then taste them. It seems like the double IPAs have the biggest impact in this area. Like if your IPA is dry hopped at, you're using like 10 ounces or more in a 5-gallon batch, your final pH is like 4.8, 4.9. You also have, likely a final gravity of 1020, 1025 or something. It just seems like all those factors on top of each other kind of leave a beer really cloying, kind of like it just doesn't invite another drink, like some other beers can. And this is not like something I've seen in any research articles or anything, but just kind of more personal preference. If we drop that pH just a little bit post fermentation, it seems to make at least those double IPAs a little bit more drinkable. And so that's kind of how we look at final pH. So it's really just trying to drop it a little lower during the process and then kind of settle out where it does. We usually don't do a whole lot after fermentation, but.
Okay.
And Scott, this is Bob. Just one quick question as a follow-up to Matt's question. What about effects of pH on stability?
Like, yeah, I'm not actually sure if the higher pH or lower pH is a better long-term for stability in those beers. That's a good question.
Yeah. This is just a group where you're looking for anything.
He doesn't care about stability. His beer's gone too fast.
Well, then you can leave the hops in your keg if it takes 2 weeks to peak.
Real quick, going back, you had talked about like kind of like that drinkability of beer and where you're getting your bitterness from. Do you think that getting your bitterness from different aspects of the full process changed? We talk always about like IBU is just a number, but their perceived bitterness and things like that. I think most of us are in line with you when we say that we don't want a sweet, especially lactose beer that doesn't have a drinkability where it's not inviting you back for more. So do you find that there's different bitterness aspect, or like different levels of bitterness, types of bitterness I should say, that drive that drinkability?
Yeah, I did. I kind of talked about it a little bit, but it's just that not doing enough on the hot side, which involves getting a lot of those IBUs, is really going to alter the drinkability, in my opinion. So, we're usually whirlpooling at about 22 pounds in a 10-barrel batch, and so that would be probably about 6 to 8 hops or ounces, I guess, on 5 gallons. I'd have to do the math on that, but most of our, Beer Smith says a lot of our beers are around 100 IBUs, and they're not. I mean, if we were to actually get them tested, they'd be a lot lower. Just because, again, you're stripping stuff. Dry hops are going to strip out some of those IBUs, but if you don't have enough supporting bitterness and you have all that sweetness, I think it does make it a little more cloying and not as drinkable. And so, I'm not too afraid of a lot of IBUs. And there's even like a little bit of what's called like an IBU pullback, where at some point you're really not getting as much as some of those calculators probably assume. Yeah, hot side, we add quite a bit. And if you're adding them cool, I think you can get away with even more, because in my opinion, the hot side is not really just about your IBUs, but that's really where you can get that base flavor. And without really pumping in a bunch of hops or hop extract into the kettle, it lacks that, and then it lacks supporting bitterness, it lacks supporting flavor, and that can all impact your drinkability.
Now, sorry, homebrewers, it's more of a pro brew question. Have you adjusted your hopping in the kettle based off of the time it takes you to get to, say, 180? Because you don't have a 4-vessel system, right? You have a 3-vessel?
Yeah, we just actually have, we just have a mash tun and a boil kettle. And so generally what we're doing is we're cooling our wort to about 170 degrees. So we run it through our heat exchanger. Goes through our heat exchanger and right back into our kettle. So it takes a little while, but we get to about 170, we turn off the pump, and then it usually jumps back up to about 180. And then we start our whirlpool and kind of let it go from there. But that's kind of how we do it. But we also do quite a bit of mash hopping too, which when I was doing research for the book, that was more about stability of hazy IPAs. So the alpha acids from hops and beta acids from hops can actually complex some of those problematic metals that cause oxidation down the road. And so, some of the research that I point to in the book, if you're dry hop, a lot of those heavy metals are actually in the grain. And so if you're, adding the hops and those, really what you're doing is adding those alpha acids during that mash. It can potentially complex some of those problematic metals, which could help, stave off some oxidation down the road. So that's where we're doing pretty, that's usually about 5 pounds for us or so in the mash. And then we're not adding again until we cool that after the kettle. Interestingly though, I've been talking to Omega yeast. They're doing some of those genetically modified strains. I don't know if you guys have followed that much.
Yeah.
But they're also just doing some fun research into mash hopping itself, or at least experimentation. And there's starting to theorize. They haven't tested it and got compound numbers yet, but it's possible that some of those active enzymes in your mash can free up some of those bound compounds in hops. And so those could kind of get freed up for later use. And then if you pair that with some of their GMO strains that are they actually take an active gene that's known for bioconverting, and then it can even grab onto those compounds that were freed in the mash and take them a step further. So that's like a new avenue where things are going. But can you imagine if all of a sudden you're throwing in 2 pounds per barrel in the mash and again in the whirlpool and then dry hopping at 4 pounds per barrel? I mean, maybe the hop suppliers are the ones behind all this.
That was my question about mass hopping. Is I'm assuming you're not throwing $18 per pound Citra in there.
Yeah, we put all of our Galaxy in the mash.
Oh, okay, good. That's where you store it, right?
No, yeah, we're doing a lot of our, sometimes if we just have bags open from previous batches, we'll use those. That's a good use, I think, for those. If we're really trying to experiment with some of those, the enzyme thing that I was talking about, then I'm using hops that are high in bound compounds, particularly bound thiols, like 3MH. So that's Mike and I will be doing a batch next week or the following week. We have a cheater hop series. We've called the cheater hops the Citras, the Galaxies. So we're trying to do a cheaper hops version of that. And so the idea is to really take what we know about science and experiment, or our own experiments and experience, and try to just push as much flavor as we can out of some of these cheaper hops, through yeast selection and process maneuvers and stuff. So we'll be using in that batch a lot of saws in the mash, just because that is one of those that's particularly high in bound 3MH. We're going to ferment it with yeast strain from Omega, which I think will eventually become public. That is, it's like a hazy IPA strain mixed with a wine yeast strain, and they just essentially made a hybrid strain. And it's a wine yeast strain that is known for its bioconverting potential. But the bonus is they actually used CRISPR to remove a phenolic gene from the hop. or from the yeast,
Awesome.
from that wine yeast. So, I mean, I've done a lot of wine yeast co-ferments with hazy IPA strains. And if there's biotransformation happening, it's usually buried under phenolic flavors from the wine yeast. And so they got rid of it, which is kind of neat. And I've done a couple test batches with this strain. And for the most part, it's maybe a little bit more attenuative than, like a 1318 or London Ale 3 on its own. But
Lactose.
yeah, we'll add a maltodextrin for that kind of thing. Yeah, that's been a kind of a fun avenue of experimentation. The one particular batch that sticks out, it was a 5-gallon batch with this strain. I used Pato. I don't know if you're familiar with the hop Pato, but Yakima Chief did some research, and the 3MH levels of Pato were like through the roof, like head and shoulders over almost all the other hops they tested. 3MH is a thiol that's like grapefruit forward. And so I used that in the whirlpool in this batch, used the wine hybrid strain, that could potentially bioconvert and pulse even more of those. And it was like grapefruit juice almost before dry hopping. So I think they're really onto something there. I think there's a lot of potential to, I think, some brewers don't like these strains at all. And, I don't have a strong opinion either way on them, other than that I think they're kind of fun to play with, and they can just build in complexity into a beer in ways that, you can't do with hops alone. We just did a collab with Bissell Brothers, and we used one of these strains on the large scale. So for that one, we used what's called Sundew. So it's a Belgian strain where they removed, again, the phenolic gene, and they claim it gets a lot of like red fruit characteristics. In our test batch, we got a little bit of that. The beer they did, there definitely was like a hint of it, but it doesn't scream it. It's not like it's replacing hops altogether or anything. And in that case, it was like way more attenuative than we were expecting. And that seems to be the trait on some of these yeasts. But, Berkeley yeast is also doing some of this. I think there's a few podcasts where they've been out talking about their strain that they're working on. I just dry hopped a test batch with that strain. And I believe that one's a little different because I'm going to talk to them more. I plan to write an article about, these strains in more detail, but I think they used a bioconverting gene from E. coli and inserted it into the yeast. So in that case, it's, that you're doing like a GMO process, but you're not using the same, organism essentially, which is a little weird. In the case for like the CRISPR ones, they were removing a gene from, Saccharomyces yeast and putting in another one that was already there in like a different yeast strain. So they're not pulling from two different, types of thing. They're not going after E. coli or anything in that case. And their first couple batches with it, Berkeley's, they got their thiol levels like incredibly high, but it also the enzyme that it creates that's active to actually break down some of these compounds can also have side activities. And in their case, the side activity was it made a compound that smells just like shit, like literal shit. So they had to go back to the drawing board and kind of dial back that enzyme activity, because what they can do is they're inserting these genes that can bioconvert, but then they can overexpress that gene, so they can take it even a step further. So it's super interesting. And the batch that I just did with them, that was after they removed the poop a little bit, it's super tropical, and this again before dry hopping. So I think there's almost to the point where it's too much. Honestly, I don't know if you've ever had like a really tropical, like a fruited sour or something with like passion fruit or guava, and it smells really good, but it's so tropical. It's almost to the point of like rubbery. I don't know if you've experienced that or not.
Oh yeah. Those are
Um,
hard fruits to work with to begin with.
Yeah.
They're weird.
So anyways, I'm not even sure what the question was. I've just been talking for like 10 minutes, but
One quick interjection with the GMOs. Have you guys played around with any mixed fermentation beers with that? Either just bread or with lactic acid bacteria?
with GMO yeast or
Yeah. With like that wine hybrid yeast,
like on the big scale, have we done it?
or just even just playing around on a small level?
Yeah, I've done test batches with every GMO strain that I think is the least that I've heard of. Just because I'm just obsessed with trying stuff out, and that's kind of what that's still the home brewer mentality, I think. Is, I don't know if there's new hop varieties or new yeast strains. It's like, okay, I know what I'm doing this weekend,
Yeah, for sure.
That's kind of how I still am here. So yeah, it's overall, so it's the wine, hazy IPA wine strain, where they removed the phenolic gene. They have a strain called Omega has another one that, of course, I just mentioned with Bissell that we did on the big scale. We did test batches. Actually, I forgot. I'm drinking one of them right now. This was their Bonanza strain.
Interesting.
So it's a hef strain, but they removed again that phenolic gene, so it's supposed to just be more banana forward. And so we tried to do we did a collab with Suspended Brewery in Baltimore. It was a vegan brewery, and so we did we called it the new milkshake, and we added macadamia milk. We used this yeast strain that's supposed to push the banana aromatics. We dry hopped it with cashmere and motueka, which I think can sometimes have this like a little banana tilt to them. And honestly, that strain, it's a little too attenuative for me. It got a beer that we wanted like 7% into the 8th. The banana character is like pretty subtle, and we fermented it at like 70, 72. I think we started at like 68, but rose it up. And it's a little hot. I'm really sensitive to that, just alcohol, heat, and IPAs. So they're definitely not, they can still play with it a little bit, but that's my favorite so far is probably that wine hazy one, and then that one from Berkeley. So we're going to do a big scale one with that cheaper hops beer. And then I'm considering like a co-pitch of that one from Berkeley, just to see if I can bring down that tropical thing a little bit, just to, bring it out of that rubbery territory. But it might be a horrible idea. We'll find out.
There's only one way to find out.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have sorry to interject, but I have a couple questions that came about from your conversation. So one thing that strikes me here is that the tropical flavor is that with that hybrid yeast has that little too tropical and a little bit like on the poop note. And the immediate thing that I thought of was durian fruit. It's like so sweet and so tropical, but has like a rotting flesh or rotting meat character to it. So it's like some people don't get it and they don't like it because of that. So I think that would be a really cool avenue to explore. But one thing that I did want to talk about that you brought up earlier was those heavy metals that you were trying to sequester in the mash. So I use Brutan B for a lot of my hot, super hoppy beers, especially the hazy stuff, because it's tannic acid or whatever the heck technically it is, but it's supposed to do that same process, and you could put it in the mash. And I have a copper chiller, and copper leaches out with an acidic mash. So that was like my process. And is that similar to what you're going for with your mash hopping?
Yep, that's exactly it. I've never used that. I don't have any experience directly with it. But yeah, that's exactly what we're attempting to do with those mash hops, is just add in some of those alpha and beta acids to get rid of some of those problematic metals. So I don't know if you've done batches side by side. It's kind of a hard thing to really test and know because, you know, unless you're sending it to a lab to see how many, you know, how much metals are in the beer, it's probably hard to tell because you don't know when your beer would have been, you know, fresher longer by, you know, just by tasting it necessarily. But I think anything you can do to try to preserve the shelf life of the hazy IPAs is at least worth, you know, worth trying.
Yeah. Do you find though that like some of that mash hop character carries over? I mean, you know, I know you talked a little bit about how, you know, those are essentially dissolved and can biotransform and all that crazy good stuff. But have you done beers side by side or more importantly, like brewed one before you did the mash hopping and then another one after you did it and noticed like a major difference?
No, not really, honestly. Like when we're adding like, you know, 4 or 5 pounds to the mash. Generally, I think I don't think it's hard to even get flavors, honestly, sometimes from your whirlpool hops. And so I think, you know, adding them to the mash for flavor is a hard thing to get. And when I'm talking more about the experimenting with higher mash hopping rates, I think that's more of a situation where you're using specific hops that would benefit from active enzymes. And then also using yeast strains that can, you know, convert those even more. And I think that's a special, almost separate case. But in the most, you know, I don't think I couldn't say with any confidence that, you know, if we're throwing in, you know, 5 pounds of Idaho 7 in our mash, that I'm tasting that in the final beer. I would, you know, that would be a stretch, I think.
Awesome, thanks. Only my one last comment. It seems kind of ironic that the vegan brewery is using a GMO yeast, but that's just a comment.
Fungus.
So you covered mash quantity or mash hop quantity. Do you do it for the entire mash or you know, maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes in? And is Idaho 7 the only one, or do you recommend some other ones?
Yeah, we honestly just use, you know, let's say we opened a bag of, you know, Amarillo is a hop that I like a lot, but I haven't opened a bag in like a year that I was willing to put in cold side and do a beer. They just haven't smelled that great to me. And so we opened it to dry hop and we just kind of call an audible and see what else we have. So we already opened that bag. And so we'll just use, you know, some of that the next day in the mash. That's kind of what we use. Those kind of the hops that you just don't really have a home for in a lot of ways. It's probably, if you look at the research, at least what they found in the study that I point to in the book is, it's probably the most beneficial to add your mash hops prior to adjusting for pH. So right away, essentially, the higher the pH of the worts, the more efficient they were at complexing those metals. So if you throw them in and give them 5-10 minutes before you adjust for the pH, that might be, you know, one more step towards potentially having a more stable beer. You know, and these are all just little things that it's hard to know exactly if it's doing that for you. But, you know, if to for these metals and found that there's a, you know, pretty dramatic reduction in them. And so, you know, what does it hurt just to throw in some hops that you probably wouldn't use anyways into your mash? So
I'm definitely going to try that. Any tips on adjusting water calculations for pH or target pH? Should you target maybe 0.1 or 2 higher if you're adding mash hops? Will that drop the pH?
You know, that's actually a good question. We just have it built into our process, and I don't know exactly, you know, what pH drop we're getting from rise we're getting from the mash hops, but I wouldn't think at, you know, a couple ounces or so that it would have a huge impact. But you know, I could be wrong on that. I guess it's pretty easy to find out. I mean, just do a mash pH, before, and then add your mash hops, and then just do another one and see if it changes at all. And then you could always just kind of adjust your acid from there, unless you're doing acid malt. But
what about additional potential bitterness contribution from the mash hops?
It's possible. You might get a few IBUs. I think, was it a New Belgium study? It's towards the end of the book, I believe. I haven't read that boring thing in so long, but there's in the back part, there's, that study that's on the pullback of IBUs, and just kind of how, like, the longer that it's in the kettle, the more reduction you get in them. And so, you're adding them before you're even into a boil. So they're kind of in there the whole time. I think that's, probably pulling back a little to have probably not much of an impact at all. But having said that, I've never, tested the same beer, with a mash hop addition and not 4 IBUs. So, but sensory wise, we can't taste, too much of a difference between mashed hop ones and not. So again, it's just another reason that I just feel like it's almost like an insurance. Why not toss them in?
Yep. Okay. Thanks.
So speaking of hops that you wouldn't use hot side or cold side for that matter, you put them in the mash. But I recently opened up I recently started rebrewing after I had a baby and then took a long hiatus. And I had some hops that were from 2014 and 2015 and 2017. And I said, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to brew with them, see what happens. Worst case, I'll dump the batch. So I wound up making an IPA, and I did a lot of cold, a lot of late edition hopping. And I, in all honesty, don't really notice that much of a difference between the hops. I mean, they were in bags, so they were sealed. They were in cold storage, so they weren't like, just sitting in my basement warm. And I think after having the conversation with you, that a lot of the flavor that I'm not getting is because I use them way too late, and I'm getting a lot more of that vegetal green flavor out of the hops instead of the brighter citrusy balanced flavor out of it. But do you have any thoughts on the age of hops, is if they're kept stored properly, so to speak, sealed in nitrogen purge bags or vacuum sealed and in cold storage?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, nice job not selling your homebrew stuff. I think every time there's a bunch of homebrew gear on like Craigslist, it's always someone that just had a baby. So at least you held on to it. That's pretty good. So I think, in your case, I would be probably comfortable using those hops too, especially after opening the bag and smelling them, because they've been stored well. The research that comes to mind on hops as they age is, of course, you're going to lose a little IBU potential, the compounds you want in the beer anyways. So using a slightly aged hop, I don't think will have a huge impact, especially if you're using it in the kettle in the whirlpool, where it's honestly just hard to get flavor in general. So as long as it smells good, you can kind of, make that judgment call and go from there. But, I will say, I don't know if you've ever brewed with like lambic hops that are like extremely aged. That is a character that I think comes through in final beer. That's like super cheesy type of thing. So, and those are beers that aren't dry hopped or anything, but, we'll have a beer sit in a wine barrel for, a year souring with bugs, and Michael take a sample, pull a nail from the barrel, and he's like, man, I smell that aged hop character, and that's after Brett, that's after PDO, that's after a barrel. So I think if it's super, super cheesy, I might not want to use it, especially in an IPA.
Yeah, I do a lot of sours and a lot of IPA. So when I open a bag and it's like, nope, I'm not going to use this for a nice clean beer, I just shove it on the shelf and I say, in a couple of years I'll get to it and I'll use it. But interestingly enough, I've been reading a little bit about the cheese aged hops, and a lot of people say the cheese phase is like that intermediate phase where you have to get past that and get to like the straw and hay and like cleaner aged flavor when they get really old. And with whole cone hops, it's a little bit easier to get there because there's more surface area and things are a little bit more exposed to oxygen than our pelletized stuff. But I mean, you get some of the continental stuff and you age it yourself in your basement, you know, or throw it in a shelf somewhere somewhat warm, top of your fridge or whatever, and you get there. I mean, I've had cheesy beers. I've made cheesy beers that are from hops that were like questionable and I didn't know better. And I think you can ride that out and you can get to a point where those flavors are not so prominent. But the Brett and the Bugs do some nice things to those flavors sometimes too, which is what you're after in a lot of cases. So
yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, if you like wanting to age hops yourself, like, you know, we'll do it. There'll be some local breweries that, you know, will buy like too much crystal or something they don't want, and they're just trying to get rid of it for like $2 a pound. And so we buy all their hops that they don't want, just poke a bunch of holes in them and just, you know, throw them in the top of a shelf for a couple of years before we'll, you know, do them in our, I dare say lambic because that's such a touchy term, but we call most of ours like Marylambics. And so we'll add those types of hops in beers like that. But you know, it's so tricky because there's so much information now, and it can all kind of can get you pointed in different directions. You know, some of those cheesy compounds have been found in some cases to be precursors for like fruity esters during fermentation. But if, you know, that's probably yeast specific and yeast driven, and, you know, depending on what you're using for primary, that could impact that. So it really kind of, like everything, kind of depends, I think.
So you're saying you want to buy 44 pounds of crystal from Bradley Brew Project. Got it.
Poke some holes in there, get some sour barrels going.
Well, we'll put it on the LTL and you'll get it in a year. Does anyone have any other questions?
What are you drinking, Scott?
I'm drinking that macadamia milkshake double IPA with cashmere and Motueka.
Wow.
It's I wish it popped. There's a little vanilla in there too. You might as well throw vanilla in any beer you're trying to make sweet and milkshakey, but
yeah.
And lactose, Matt.
Well, it's vegan. It's vegan.
That's right. It was weird throwing in a whole bunch of macadamia milk into the kettle. That was weird. Oh yeah, I forgot. We also added a whole bunch of bananas to the beer, like actual bananas. We threw them in. I think, what did we do? We took hot wort and threw the bananas in a homebrew pot, and then added hot wort into it and smashed up all the bananas, and then added that directly to the fermenter, I believe. So they were like sanitized just with the heat of the wort, and then and the first trub dump on that beer was kind of disgusting. It was like oxidized banana, like trub and macadamia milk stuff. It was unique, but honestly, you know, that's why I like doing collabs. When you're doing a beer with another brewery, I feel like that's when you get a little more creative and take more risks. Because otherwise, what's kind of the point? You know, if another brewery wants to do a double IPA and they're like, you know, I really like Citra, and we're like, well, we really like Mosaic. It's like, well, let's put those together. What could happen? It's like, well, we kind of know at this point, right? So that's why I like taking some risks in those collab beers. But you almost can kind of each brewery can kind of hide behind the other too, because if it's bad, you can just go, you know, they did it.
I think Daniel has a question.
Yeah, I had a question. So in the book, a couple of things that stood out to me were chit malt and Manchester yeast. I wanted to hear, you know, some comments on those two things.
I think the proudest moment after that book came out is Chris, who owns Maryland Homebrew, told me she had to start stocking chip malt because of that. I was like, yes. Never felt so important. We like chip malt. You know, it's an under modified malt. You know, it's high in the like an LTP1 protein, which is the same protein that's, you know, beneficial for head retention. And it's one of those areas in the book where I sort of like piece together research and kind of theorize more than have exact data from. But it seems like getting those proteins into your beer is another potential avenue towards stability. So that's one thing. And also, we like the head retention we get from it. It's kind of that nice frothy, like, you know, there's like two different kinds of head retention. You know, you get some of those beers that are just those tight little bubbles that just kind of like dissipate. And then you get some that's just like super white and dense, almost foamy. And we get a little bit more of that with chip malt.
So do you cut back carapils when you do that, or do you add carapils in that situation, or foam or whatever you use?
Pretty much just chip. So I mean, like
Okay.
a typical IPA or double IPA will be, you know, 10% chip malt, 10% malted wheat, 10% malted naked oats, and then, you know, two row and some pills. Sometimes we get maybe just a little less color when we throw in some pills. And that's, you know, we pretty much stick to close to that for most of our bases. So, you know, 10% chip malt has been kind of where we've settled.
Cool. And Manchester yeast? Yeah, I was gonna ask about that.
Yeah, that was just a favorite from my home brewing. I tried, you know, Y yeast and, you know, all the different versions of London Ale 3. And to me that, you know, they're essentially the same strain, but I do think sometimes supplier to supplier can be just slightly different. And in that case, you know, Manchester to me had just this tiny little vanilla note that you know, it's pretty subtle, but it was something I could even smell from like the Krausen or when I harvested the yeast. And I just kind of like that to like just round out and smooth out beers. I mean, if you add, we'll do like sorbet versions of IPAs, and it's just essentially adding vanilla to it. And it just that character just like vanilla just rounds out and kind of softens a beer in a way that you can't get otherwise. And so if I could just get a little touch of that from the yeast, I like that. But we've tried a whole bunch. There's a local yeast company called Jasper. We've done their 1318 or their London Ale 3. I like that just as well. But we've actually settled back, and we're now doing RVA again. So and typically we'll get one pitch. We'll do like a 10 barrel pitch or 10 barrel batch of like a pale ale, and we'll harvest that and do 2 20 barrel batches from it. So like an IPA and a double IPA, and then we just buy a whole nother pitch again for them. So
Also,
yeah.
to put in there the beauty of knowing a yeast and how it will perform. It's very important.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And especially when you are canning beer and you have to have a label submitted three weeks before the beer is done fermenting, and you have to know the ABV.
Beautiful in yeast selection.
Yeah.
How has canning been going for Sapwood?
Pretty good, honestly. You know, before COVID, we weren't doing any canning really. We did a couple little runs with another brewery where we had them brew a beer for us, and we canned it. But you know, it worked out great. They made great beer, but I think, you know, Mike and I are just too involved and like to be in charge of every step of the process. And so it just, you know, having someone else brew your beer and then having it canned was nice to have our beer in cans, but it just makes me too nervous. Like, how are they dry hopping? How are they purging that vessel while they're dry hopping? Are they purging all the lines and hoses before they transfer? You know, it's just, it was too much to think about and not have control over. So we just moved away from canning altogether. And then just like every other brewery, when COVID started, we started getting Ironheart in, which is a mobile canning service, and putting our beer, mainly our hoppy beers in cans. And honestly, we were probably idiots to not be doing that from the start. I mean, people really like hoppy beers in cans, and we were doing 10 barrel batches, and they were disappearing a lot sooner than we wanted. So we, during COVID, got 3 20 barrel tanks, which basically doubled our production, and those cans are, you know, disappearing about how we want. But now that, you know, the tasting room is picking back up again and people are getting vaccinated.
We're all our kegs.
Yeah, so now we're gonna have to start adding more beer to kegs and pivot again. But yeah, canning really made us improve our game, I'd say. Like there's nothing like a dissolved oxygen meter bringing some reality to your process. And so, you know, that's when we really got serious about using like dry hop dosers, you know, so you're dry hopping without ever opening up your tank. You know,
what kind of PPBs are you getting? Because I know we use Iron Heart also, and it's really nice when they show up with their O2 sensor or their DO sensor. And we were shocked. I mean, we, you know, coming from home brewing and just the idea of oxygen is the enemy, and going, you know, starting pro brewing, it was like, that was like, I wore it on my sleeve. I was like, keep that fucking oxygen out of this beer, you know. And so we never had our beers DO'd, but, you know, same thing, you know, like we don't have closed, you know, we have to still open dry hop, but, you know, we're running CO2 through it for positive pressure and things like that. And the first time they were like 15 parts, we were like, wait, what? So it's really cool to see like all these things that you took from homebrewing and seeing it apply to a professional aspect where it's actually making a difference.
Yeah, I think it's almost easier to have less oxygen with some of the gear that you are lucky enough to have in the homebrew level or in the professional level.
I don't want to say that, but yeah.
it's so much easier to purge stuff, and honestly, like it's just like you're not as afraid to make a mess to do stuff to go out of your way, because it's easy just to spray down the brew deck. It's not as easy just to spray down your kitchen, you know. So like if you're just running a bunch of beer out of a line before you actually start going into a vessel or whatever, there's a lot of stuff like that. But I think our DO numbers are now generally around 25 to 30 in tank. I honestly don't have numbers to like really compare that to others, but I can tell you it's better than the first couple of runs we did. So, but yeah, it's hard. You can always think you're doing a great job, but it's hard to hide behind actual tested.
Oh yeah. So I know we have a few more questions. I didn't want to take up your time. I know Dan had to jet out for a second. So do you have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Still got half a beer here.
Oh, wow. That's like what, 3 hours?
Half a beer's worth of questions.
I think Tony.
3 minutes for me. Hurry up.
Someone get this guy another beer.
Exactly. I've got so many questions, but you know,
So many
actually,
questions.
in your book, you talk about fermentation profile, and it's actually quite complex, where you're pitching warm, then you're cooling down, then you're crashing, then you're increasing again. No, then you're dry hopping, then you're increasing. Like, you're doing a lot of crazy things with the fermentation profile. But if that's going to take too long to get into, I'd rather just cut to the chase and say, what's your favorite Whirlpool hops and your favorite dry hop combos today?
Favorite Whirlpool hops. I wrote an article, if you're interested in it. It's called what I name it, something survivables. So Mike and I have been just using random hops in the Whirlpool since we started, and then I'm constantly tasting those beers before we dry hop to see what, if any, hop character we're actually retaining. And sometimes, like, you'll taste the beer pre-dry hop after fermentation, and it's like pretty much zero hop character, at least to my nose and my palate. I don't get hardly anything. But I think the first hop that I used that I was kind of blown away by was Idaho 7. We used that in the Whirlpool, and it was It was super potent. I mean, it's not like it would taste a dry hop by any means, but the amount of just like this piney kind of pineapple-y flavor that was in there I was so impressed by that. I was like, we tried it again, and then again we got those same results. And in fact, now we kind of back it down, so we're not using like 100% Idaho 7 in the beer because I think it might actually get in the way a little bit depending on your dry hops. But we didn't know why that was the case. But then Yakima Chief just did some research where there's thousands of compounds in hops, but they decided to focus on the ones that are actually in finished beer. Because, if it's not making its way through the process, it's probably not that important. And what they found was Idaho 7 is one of those hops that had the most of what they then dubbed the survivable compounds. So it had the highest makeup of these compounds. So it's a collection of thiols, monoterpene alcohols, hop-derived esters. It just has the highest amount of these important ones that are surviving the whole process. And so there's a little bit of science backing why we didn't know Idaho 7 was so great, but we were so high on it. It was just because it's one of those high survivable hops. But they did, tested a whole bunch of hops and put them they have a nice chart that kind of summarizes what they found. But for the most part, it's like Mosaic is a really good hot side hop. We'll use that quite a bit. Mosaic Incognito is something that I really like too. I think that imparts a lot of flavor on the hot side. Columbus and Cascade are still pretty good hot side hops in our opinion. We do. I like Bravo on the hot side, and Amarillo on the hot side is another one that I really like.
What do you think about Chinook? I taste Chinook like crazy when I use it in the Whirlpool.
Yeah, I think Chinook is one that's relatively high in 3MH, and depending on the yeast strain you're using, you might even pull a little more out of that. I just realized I contracted about 88 pounds of Chinook, so I'm going to be using a lot of that in the hot side coming up here. So we'll see.
Yeah, it flame out. And
so I'm glad to hear you say that.
Well, you're welcome.
A question about the Idaho 7, and it's kind of reels it back into questions about hops and contract. I was just talking to Crosby Hops, just doing research on contracting everything, and they were telling me that Idaho 7 is best used in the Whirlpool when you open up the bag and let it air out first before putting it into the Whirlpool, being that there's some compounds that will flash off just at room temperature before putting it into the Whirlpool. Have you seen this with any hops? Is there some credence to that?
I mean, I guess you would think that those compounds would kind of be degassed almost, if you will, like while they're packaging them, if it's that volatile. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it seemed like they were trying to wheel and deal me, but I will say
Idaho 7 is one of those hops that, like, when you open a bag, like it's almost that rotten pineapple thing with a lot of pine. It's like very
when it's starting to turn.
Yeah,
just starting to brown. Yeah.
And surprisingly, when we dry hop with it, we don't get much flavor at all, which is weird.
I will say, like with that, like on this hour-long conversation I had with this person, I opened the bag of Idaho 7 that they sent me, and by the end of the conversation, that Idaho 7 had turned into more like a fresh pineapple that you just cut into that was prime. So it's like that I think that's what's driving this question, is because I was myself kind of taken aback that I opened this bag and an hour later it was more of a pleasant character than it was like, really sharp and kind of like, like, to use the word dank, where nobody actually knows what dank smells like, but it was dank and pineapple. Yeah. But then after an hour of it being open and open to oxygen, it kind of turned into like a sweet pineapple. that wasn't necessarily, about to rot. Like, so that, I guess that's where my question comes from, is like, is there, we know that oxygen plays a role in the degradation of the compounds on hops. Is there something to, opening up a bag of hops and letting it rest, quote unquote, for an hour before you put it in whirlpool? Obviously not, you wouldn't do that for dry hop because that's ridiculous. But you know what I'm saying? Like,
I don't know the science on that necessarily, but there are obviously, if you're smelling it, there's compounds coming out of that. We do, I guess, without really realizing it or with a reason, open our hot bags for about a half an hour or so before putting them in the whirlpool. But that's just kind of more like, I open the bag, I make sure Ken, one of our brewers, smells it, I smell it, and Mike smells it, and we're all on board to dumping it in, type of thing. And so it just sits out. I suppose it's possible that some of those like hydrocarbons are being released. I would be amazed it would happen that quickly, but I could be wrong. But also, if it's really that volatile, I think adding it to the kettle where it's really hot, I would tend to think that it would just volatilize instantly anyways. But yeah, I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think that's why they're saying for whirlpool aspect of it, that maybe like makes a little bit more sense. But also Idaho 7, Citra never came onto the market. Idaho 7 would have taken that spot, in my opinion.
Honestly, I don't know how often you dry hop with it. It's just one of those hops that I did all Idaho 7 dry hop, and for as pineapple-y as that taste or smelled in the bag, it just didn't come across in the beer. I haven't done it multiple times, but I was kind of shocked by that for a hop that's so good on the hot side, but seemed to be subtle on the cold side is intriguing. And I think it has more to do with some of these compounds needing heat, needing to be broken down a little bit to play a part. But
then you could argue that Omega needs to step up their game and make a yeast that will do that in the cold side.
Honestly, what I wanted them to do is, and I'll hint this when I write the article. I don't know if they'll listen to it or read it, but I'd be interested for them to play with if there's a gene that's responsible for like glycerol production during fermentation.
Oh yeah,
I'd be interested in that. I mean, you can taste wines, super dry wines that have like pretty remarkable mouthfeel, and there's no sugars really in them. It's not. It's probably more of a glycerol production thing, I'm assuming. I would love to be able to bring down our double IPAs, 5 points or so, just to make them a little bit more drinkable. I think that would bring them out of balance a little bit, just because of that mouthfeel thing. But if I could just get a little more glycerol production from the yeast, I think that would be something that I hope that they can look at to try to build into like a hazy IPA wine hybrid thing.
Or glycerol producing.
We're all counting on you, Omega.
Sorry. Give it a long list of things you're looking for.
One question. Sorry, Matt.
Go for it.
No,
Go for it, man.
I was just gonna ask because you mentioned glycerol. So I read one of your articles where you talked about glycerol from kind of like that early hotter step in your fermentation profile. Is that something you guys are doing, pretty consistently? Like you're knocking out at whatever 72, 73 or something, and then letting it go for a bit and bringing it back down?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of glycerol production, I'm not sure that has much of an impact, but yeah, we're usually always knocking out about 170, 180. And now I've almost gotten to the point where when we're like temperature wise through the lifespan of a beer, it's, we started mashing around 156 or so. It really just kind of depends. I think mash temperature is so tricky because like how we measure the mash temperature, it could not actually be what the actual mash is.
My question was fermentation. So like 70.
Oh, I thought you said 170. So I was thinking.
I might have said 170. I meant like 72. So what, like I think you wrote an article where you talked about knocking out in the low 70s, right? And how having a positive impact in mouthfeel.
Yeah.
I guess I was sort of wondering if that's something you guys, and I think you speculated in that article that it was related to glycerol, right? Glycerol
Yeah.
production.
I forgot all about that, but yeah, so I think the idea there was if you pitch warm and bring it down, I think I was saying there's potential that you could get more glycerol production at that early stage.
Yeah.
And that's honestly, that's something I would love to look at more and do more testing with to see if that's actually a thing or not. But we tend to just play it safe here and just kind of pitch colder and then build up. Just I don't want any like unwanted fermentation character. And I'm like, it's so sensitive to just that alcohol heat thing that I'm afraid to go too much above, generally, like if we're doing a double IPA, we'll knock out at like 66 and we'll give it, a day, 2 days at 66 and let it really get going. And then maybe go 67 day 3 and 68 day 4. And then once it's slowing down, it's about 10:30 or so, then we'll just go to like 72 or 74 and just let it finish out and then go down. But honestly, in terms of glycerol, that, I think the threshold for glycerol to make a difference might be too high for us to really get there, but something I should probably look at.
Yeah, sorry. I guess I encountered that article because we had probably forgot. I think we had forgot to set the tank temperature and came in the next day and it's like, crap, this thing's at 72. We set it and then whatever 68 or whatever we normally run at. And it ended up being one of our best batches. And and I was trying to like figure out why the hell, and I'm like, it like had the best taste ability, like, nice full mouthfeel, like just real good. It was just a really good batch of, this particular beer that we do. And I came across that article and I was like, aha, but it sounds like maybe there was something else to that.
Honestly, how big of a beer? Do you remember how big it was?
It's not a huge beer, like a 6.5% beer.
Yeah. So I
like 3.5 finishing gravity.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of our best lower alcohol beers was one of our first we did. And our heat exchanger broke mid fermentation and we came in, it was like 69, 70 degrees on a pale ale. And same thing, potentially there was a little more glycerol production, but also maybe just on a lower ABV beer, maybe you push the phenolics, or I mean, not the phenolics, but just esters, and you got a little bit more of a fruity character out of that. Without bringing, alcohol heat, because you're not asking the yeast to, go crazy. So, maybe I'm always a little more obsessed with trying to push yeast derived flavor in low alcohol beers, just because it's so much harder. Like you get better dry hop extraction in a double IPA than you will in IPA, and even less in like a session IPA. Alcohol is an extractant and it helps pull stuff from the hops. And so if you can just boost that profile from the yeast, I think that's a good thing. So maybe that's what happened with yours. It's just like a little bit more, ester production, glycerol and whatever. But yeah, that's kind of some of the new research I've been reading now is how, alcohol can impact extraction, and even something as much as like the alpha acid content in the hop. So the higher the alpha acid, the lower the extraction. That one study found during dry hopping. It was almost like the alpha acid itself was like holding in some of these oils. And so I actually emailed the author and talked to him a little bit. And, we were talking about like agitating hops and burping them. Potentially in high alpha hops, if you're dry hopping, maybe agitation more than once a day might be useful. Especially in a low alcohol beer, because it's kind of, low alcohol is getting worse extraction anyways, and high alpha acid might also be getting low extraction. So, multiple burps or agitations under pressure might be a good thing. But that's just kind of, I don't even know why I just brought that up, but
Always interesting.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense.
I have a
Thanks.
fun thing about Fred, to like kind of jump on what you're saying. Something that happened to us is we lost the tropical storm that came through here. I don't know, it was August maybe. We lost power, and one of our flagship beers, that's still a thing apparently. Breweries still have flagship beers. Got up to 78 degrees. And honestly, you would not know the difference. And we had pitched it 36 hours before this happened. So like, as a home brewer, you're like, no, you have to do these specific things because that's how it's done, and it will be different if you don't. And then when you get hit with these things, you're like, but it's not different. Like you brought up you brought up match temperature, and you're like, I don't even know what match temperature it's at. It's like, this is what we're targeting. We use these metrics to hit it. We're not 100% sure that it's there. I know the exact feeling because like our mash tun reads 6 degrees lower sometimes, so it's the same thing where it's like, does mash temperature matter? So my question would be like, does anything matter?
Nope.
No. Okay, cool. Anyways.
Nope. Just try it all. Worst case scenario, you make beer.
Yeah, that's true.
I was going to say, and Dan, you always just say, in the end, just throw some bread in it.
In the end, just pitch Brett. If shit goes awry, just pitch Brett, and it's not going to get worse.
But my suggestion, so what we started using this compost thermometer. It's 36 inches long, or you can get it in 48 inches also. And we do spot checks in our mash to get we do it every 15 minutes just to check if we're actually at the temperature that we think we're at. So
size matters, huh?
Yeah. Well, when we use 36 because we're a 7-barrel mash.
I'm just kidding. We've moved to if you spend it, I don't know, it's like $200-300, you get a thermometer that's within like 0.01 or 0.02.
Yeah.
And we'll use one of those in the top and just kind of put it in, but that's not necessarily what's in the center.
Yeah.
And so it's a little tricky to know exactly what we're getting. And I give Mike a hard time sometimes because it doesn't matter what thermometer it is, or if it's brand new or if it's old, he doesn't trust it. So it's like, what's the point? Why do we keep buying all these thermometers?
Yeah. I like not trusting things.
Yeah, because then you can always just make it work in your favor. Well, yeah, it reads 160 and we wanted 165. Well, it's 5 degrees off.
Yeah.
I do think homebrew batches, though, you get a pretty good sense of your mash temperature just because you don't have to stick your thermometer that far down in to get a good reading, and you can stir around where you're reading it. And I would almost always mash pretty high, like 159, 158, 160 when I was doing hazy IPAs with Manchester. So honestly, I don't know how that correlates. I would think that now we're probably, I think you might lose a little bit on the homebrew scale. I think you might drop temperature a little quicker. And so like when we're mashing at, 156, but we have an insulated kettle, there's so much there, it's not really losing temperature. 160 on the homebrew might be more like a 156 on the big scale. So
final temperature, right?
Yeah.
So haze stability, and like, what do you think are the most important factors? Is it oat and wheat? Is it hops? Any thoughts on that? Trying to get that sort of stable haze without using lactose. Sorry.
Lactose, flour, and dirt. We use we usually use, I think malted wheat is a big part of haze. I just think that the types of proteins in malted wheat help with that. So that's usually why we're adding about 10% malted wheat in most of our beers. Oats, just because it's, beta glucans can help with that too. And oats are high in that. Maybe even, rye can do the same thing. well, we add rye in some of our beers. I tend to like rye with like Mosaic and Nelson and Holler Tower Blanc, just a little bit more cohesive, I think. But so, the grain bill matters, but I also think it's a combination of factors. I mean, it's also the yeast strain you're using. Despite being the most flocculent strains, these English, advertised as flocculent strains, these English ale strains seem to produce hazier beers than a lot of other strains. I think it also matters what hops you're using. Surprisingly, there's certain hops that we use seem to have more haze than others. Galaxy, for example, Citra, Mosaic, they just seem to impart more haze. There's a little bit of new research I was watching in the craft brewing conference or whatever it was this year. There was someone giving a presentation, and they were looking at it might have something to do with like beta acids, and hops might be binding to polyphenols more efficiently than others. So potentially higher beta acid hops could be inducing more haze in beers, which Galaxy is a relatively high beta acid hop. So that's something we'll keep looking at and try to figure out. But I think early active dry hopping during active fermentation might potentially help with that, but we don't do hardly any of it, and our beers are pretty hazy and stay hazy. And so for us, it's heavy dry hopping, 3 to 4 pounds per barrel, which is we consider heavy. Fairly heavy whirlpool hopping, 2 pounds per barrel. Using an English ale strain, like we use Manchester or London Ale 3 or Conan, for example, has worked great. 10% wheat, 10% oats or rye. I think it's a combination of all those things that kind of help play a role. But we've tried to intentionally make some beers clear. We tried to do a West Coast IPA and added a finding agent, and we cold crashed it harder than we usually do. We only usually cold crash to like 35. We're doing everything we could to clear up the beer, and it didn't. And so, I don't know exactly what it is, but I just think it's the connection or the combination of things. I will say though, we did do one beer where we pitched USO 5, and was it 05 or 04 and London Ale 3, and that beer did clear up. I don't know why.
It's a 4 for you. It will strip everything out of a beer.
Yeah. So I think, it's just a combination of things, but yeast is probably a big part of the haze.
Cool, thanks.
Scott, one thing that I've been wondering was, I know you guys have played around a lot with Michael strain, with Mad Fermentationist. How high have you been able to kind of take the IBUs in earlier generations and still pull like a pretty good amount of acidity out of that culture?
We only use that strain because he's contracted with them. We both don't like it.
Really? Well, I happen to.
No, I'm totally kidding. No, we do. We love that strain. We've actually moved to, so we'll like pre-acidifies a lot of our beers that we use that with. So say we're making a Saison, you can pitch, I think, we'll buy like what is it? The lacto blend, Omega lacto blend, I think it is.
605.
And we'll do a 2-liter starter or something with it. And this is for our huge batch. That's all we'll do. The night before, a 2-liter starter.
Wow.
We'll knock out the next day. We'll pour in that starter of lacto and just give it a head start before we pitch that yeast. And it just kind of helps bring the pH down to where I like it. I think generally around like 3.3, 3.4 is where I like a lot of those kind of beers. Surprisingly, it seems like people that buy our beers like them like a lot more sour than that. But I think drinkability wise, from my own preference, is around like 3.3, 3.4. So doesn't really answer your question because of the IBU mark, but in some ways, we're we're not going very, we're still probably like 5 or 10 IBUs. If we want to stop the lacto from still going, we add like hexalone, a hop extra. Just it's enough alpha acids to stop the lacto, and can also have some other benefits like mouthfeel and head retention, which especially in the sour beers is helpful. Probably a better question for Mike in terms of how high IBUs you can go with that strain and still get a little bit of sourness. I don't think he tended to get a lot of sourness from that when he was doing it, just pitching that, but I could be wrong.
I have only over time.
Okay.
3 to 5 IBUs in like 8-10 months. It's finally a pretty good kind of middle of the road, more than tart, not quite acidic, but enjoyable, good character to it.
Yeah, like a 3.6 or 3.7 pH or something like that.
Oh, that was before I got the real deal and got a pH meter.
Yeah.
I don't know. I will say not too sour for my palate, but it was good. I do enjoy that strain. The bread in there is beautiful.
Yeah, I like it too. I think we'll use it a lot of times as a base, but then a lot of those beers will go into barrels that we throw additional cultures in, so it's just kind of a good starting point for a lot of those beers. And then we don't care much about the IBUs if we're going to be pitching additional PDO into those. So
yeah, for sure. What's funny is that I had read the article you had posted of your trip to Belgium with Sean, who's actually with us tonight.
See that he's a quiet guy on this.
Yeah, he's a quiet guy, But
Hi.
I got married like 2 months after that, and my end of the bargain for our honeymoon was that I selected to go to Belgium because that's what you do as a nerd. And after reading that post, I was inspired to not only go to Grote Dorst, but also to order a shit ton of vials off of Amazon, and literally went around Belgium collecting vials. And it's now what I've done every trip, and I've been to Belgium 3 times now, every single time. And flash forward a couple of years, I now have a couple barrels in my basement with a couple long-term sour projects. Some of these guys are involved too, but it's literally been a culmination of just collecting dregs in vials of beers that I enjoyed, saving them up for the initial inoculation, pitching them, and letting them go. So I do accredit you two guys for the inspiration behind that.
That's awesome. That's cool to hear. I still have 15-gallon barrel at home where I don't even pitch anything new to it each year, but I still fill it and empty it. And just like, you were mentioning, it's from that trip is where those bugs came from. But I'm pretty sure Sean thought I was an idiot, but
I mean, I definitely got looks.
He was like, is anyone looking? Let me pour the dregs.
Yeah, I mean, I had, Ponytail Man at Cantillon looking at me like, what the hell is this American guy doing? And I'm sitting there just, pouring out some weird experimental lambic they had.
I mean, if you're going to be spending money on yeast, you might as well get or yeast or bacteria, you might as well get a really good beer out of it too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, hey, shit, it's worked out pretty well so far. So
I think, what is Mike? I forget his line. It's something like pitch dregs with a resume or something.
Yeah. No, that's so true. And what's funny is that some of them have been pretty, 3F heavy, and my one barrel is really starting to take on just that like straight up 3F sesame tone to it, like that distinctful. And I'm just like, well, there's been at least 20 bottles dregs worth of 3F beers into it. I think it's kind of just overtaken it, but I guess there's worse things than that.
And say we now have parties where that's what we do.
Yeah, no, it's literally it. Like there's inoculation parties. We have a big share, throw everything in a mason jar, and put it in the barrel.
We started a policy here where if any staff person brings in a bottle, a mixed firm bottle that's really good and ends up dregs going into a barrel, that we will pay for that bottle. It's more of a selfish reason to have people bring really good beers in.
Reinvestment.
I like that. Well, I will keep that in mind when I finally do get down there. I'll make sure to pull something nice to bring down and share.
That's good company policy there.
Yeah, I like that. That's a place where I want to be.
And it's a tax write-off.
Yeah. Well, it's like someone brings in like a $30 bottle and they don't want to pay for it, right? So So they just watch Mike as he takes the drink. They're like,
It's the old goose loophole, oldest trick in the book.
gonna be paid for.
That's awesome. Well, cool. Well, anyone have some other questions they want to leverage Scott's way before I feel bad we're taking so much time? I know you're still at work.
Very Sapwood Cellar question. When are you making your first seltzer? All right, guys, calm down.
I attempted to make a 15-gallon thing of seltzer 2 weeks ago.
Mhm.
It didn't ferment. It tasted real chalky and smelled weird. So
Right. You should talk to your peeps at Omega. 'Cause they have the solution. They do.
yeah.
Just filter the shit out of it and put it in a White Claw can. You'll be all right.
Oh, hey! I actually had someone for a long time. I was like, no, we're not doing that. And then our rep from Country Malt was like, you like brewing pilsners? And I was like, yeah, because there was nothing to hide behind. He goes, all right, well, yeah, there's literally nothing to hide behind.
That's true.
Literally
Touche.
It is water.
What I think is interesting about seltzers is they seem like a good base for those like over the top fruited beers.
Mhm.
I mean, you literally aren't tasting the beer anyways, so why not just make a bunch of seltzer? And
There's a company in Chicago called Ooge, I think, or Smooge, and they're doing.
Oh yeah.
They're doing.
It's seltzer and puree.
Yeah, seltzer and puree. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a thing. They're called seltzer smoothies.
Yeah, and Hype Boys are losing their shit over them.
Yeah. I don't necessarily believe
Wait,
it
is
now.
the company called The Veil?
No,
No.
not
Oh,
yet.
okay.
No.
Sorry.
Don't show shade. Come on. But my question is, do you have a lot of people being like, are you guys making a seltzer?
not beer people necessarily.
Okay.
Honestly, what I would like to if I could have a seltzer on one of the lines or just in cans as like an option for people that don't want beer that are with beer people, I really don't have a problem with that. It's like
I think it's a smart business move for sure.
you're trying to please more people and you want them to stay longer, and so that's one thing. But the like brewer side of me is like, well, how can I make the seltzer more interesting? I think like one, or at least more like natural. It's not just a seltzer with some extract poured in. Like I don't know if you've ever had like a piquette, which is like
Oh yeah.
it's just like grape skins that have been used, right, are usually discarded where they add water.
It's like the Meerts of wine world.
Yeah, they add water, they add sugar, and ferment it and carbonate it, and it's those. I like that a lot, and so in a way, that's kind of a seltzer. It's a seltzer with skin contact from like a second use grape skin.
Right. And your character comes from the skin. It's the tannins, and it's that you really don't get much sugar or fermentables that are even left in there at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of those piquettes, I'm guessing they keep some of their wine in the tank. There's always some in there when you're rinsing second use grapes. So I was looking at some some grape skins last night. Actually, I was talking with our tasting room manager, and I want to make like a skin contact seltzer.
Well,
and go that route. So I think you can still do them and make them interesting. And then I just don't know if I'll have to see if that's like legal for us. That's a Mike question, luckily.
I think it is.
Yeah.
It's definitely legal. We just did one that we're releasing on Thursday. I didn't bring up this question just so I could plug it. Hibiscus and grape must. So it is technically legal. We did the hibiscus for the sourness of it to drive some perceived sweetness without it being sweet. And then obviously the tannins in it, and then the grapes for the tannins also. And yeah, man, that's what I've been drinking after I finished my Bitburger. So it's quite enjoyable. I'm surprised.
That's a seltzer base?
Yeah, seltzer. corn sugar, straight corn sugar.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. I think that seems still kind of fun to me.
Yeah. So and that was like the theory. I mean, my buddy Travis up in Drownlands, he was kind of in the same predicament where he was like, the owners were like, we want a seltzer, and he was like, well, the only way I'm doing a seltzer is if I put it in a foeder. And so another great idea behind it, which is, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. But I think that the whole idea behind, I mean, like the stubbornness of thinking that, well, I'm not going to do it because it's not brewing is kind of like daft, because it is brewing. First of all, it's very tough. It's like making cider, where you don't do cider right, you're just drinking a sulfur drink. But we did Lutra from Omega with their seltzer DAP edition, whatever it is, and
It's like an enzyme or something.
No, it's just it's like it's free
Or
nitrogen.
boost or something, right?
Yeah.
Did you? I'll pick your brain here. Did you oxygenate it like you would a beer, and did you add the DAP?
DAP at Whirlpool.
Multiple stages, multiple days.
No, it was just DAP at Whirlpool. And we did so we also, what's cool about it is we created the base, added the DAP at Whirlpool. Before we added the hibiscus, we actually pulled some off just to kind of see what the character of the base would be, so that we could build other things on it.
You to the base of the water.
Yeah, just the water.
I give you a hard time.
With the DAP, or with the nutrient addition. So we fermented that separately, just so we knew what that base was, so we could discern the difference.
Yes.
But and then we oxygenated like you would. For us, it's like 4 liters. Number 4 on our thing for 30 minutes. Anyways, we pitched Luca at 88 degrees. It fermented at 90 degrees. It was done in 4.5 days. And then we added the grape addition at the end of it. It was still about 85 degrees at that point, but there was, I mean, honestly, outside of doing the like hop fermentation, there was really no difference to like your standard procedure when you knock off and oxygenate there. I mean, granted, it was at 90 degrees when we knocked off, which was very weird for me. I'd never done that before. And I'm like, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel right. It was RO water. We are, luckily we're a 5-barrel brew house, so we can, it only takes us about 6 hours to make RO. I don't know if that really impacted it that much. Yeah, the water's clean, but I think that you could kind of flub that in just balancing the water character.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that I mean, that really was, I mean, I picked Omega's brain for a while about it, because I'd already, I'd done some research, and I'd asked them about their addition, and it's their addition is based off of a 5% beer. So, if you were stressing that, or 5% seltzer, if you were stressing it past that, I think that's where the issue would come, where you'd have to do multiple additions. But just at 5%, I think it works great. Not as, I would say, perceivable sulfur, not there. I mean, I'm sure there is some, that you could test for. Yeah, it blew my mind. It really did. I thought it was going to be very hard to figure this out, and they were like, "Oh, just do this and this, and you're good." And it worked. So I think if you're looking for that as an option, or as a way to make the base to work on, I mean, our theory is we're going to do a bunch of teas. We have a local tea place, so we're going to kind of tap into that and do a bunch of different teas with, and we also have a local fruit place that does fresh purees for us. And not like those smoothie things, but like, a small amount just to give a tartness or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
I think it's a viable option. I mean, they're super cheap to make. I hate to say it that way, but I mean, let me put it this way. I don't know if you could, if you could see my picture, but our brew house is very like, like home goods. And so our clientele, I love our clientele because they're
Very Pinteresty.
Yeah, Pinterest. That's the word. I think that's what people have said about it. Our clients, we're 5 blocks from the beach. So during the summer, we get a lot of people who say, "Oh, I don't drink beer. What should I drink?" And we have a gluten-free beer that's basically fruit puree, and like people like
And
like,
lactose.
all the people, and lactose. And so like all the people that come in, that don't drink beer, drink that, or like people who I find this so funny. People who like, there's a lot of local gyms, they'll come here afterwards and be like, I'll have the gluten-free beer. And we're like, that's probably the worst beer to drink. Because it's like, it finishes at, I don't know, like 8 Play-Doh. Yeah, and
It's full of puree.
So it's kind of the same thing where it's like, well, we want a fun avenue to do things that you really like. You put tea in beer and it's fun, but you don't get the tea. You get like a different character. What you're pulling out of it is more tannins than you are that true character. And so with the seltzers, that's the idea. Is we're gonna, Earl Grey tea is a beautiful tea when used properly, but when you put it in a beer, it's like, ugh. So anyways,
yeah, it's kind of the it's kind of the joy of home brewing versus a brewery.
Yeah.
You're brewing exactly what you want at home because that's what you're interested in, and then sometimes at a brewery you have to brew what will sell and also what will keep people there or keep people happy or make it more of an experience for everyone who comes. Like my mom and dad visited about 2 weeks ago, and my dad was drinking double IPAs and my mom was drinking a rosé I made for myself on the back and a tap line. So it's like,
yeah,
you're trying to please everyone like that. And
yeah.
so, yeah.
Oh no, I think that is a tough part in, business wise, like coming up with, the schedule of like what we're going to brew. And like, because of COVID, we've gone to, every 10 and a half days we can 4 different beers, and it becomes difficult when like the like classic joke of like our salesperson's like, you're gonna make 4 double IPAs, right? And we're like, do you really want 4 double IPAs? Because if we make you 4 double IPAs, you're gonna say, hey, I need some variety. But like kind of what we joke about is like with the owner. I mean, the owners are great people, and what we joke about is we'll give them like X every 2 can runs. We'll give them X beers just so that we can put in like a alt beer, just so we can make it for ourselves. And it doesn't sell as quick, but it keeps people interested. It gives us variety, but like we want to drink that, and that's why we're brewing it. And like, sure, if it sells well, that's great. We don't really care past that point.
I get it.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, it's tough. People want double IPAs.
Not me.
I think it was the guy who owns Modern Times told us, told Mike when we opened up, he's like, if you don't can a hazy IPA, then you don't like money.
Yeah.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let's be a realist.
Right?
Right?
I don't know why it took us 2 years to listen to that, but
yeah. Well, it's the element, right? We all know that you probably got to sell your soul at some point, but when is that point?
Well, it's not selling your soul. It's being conscious of what business is, and you don't open a bakery to make not bread. It's like, it's
now you open a brewery to make baked goods.
Pretty much. It's batter.
I mean, that's
basically
literally
batter.
what's going on as I push away this pastry stout.
I can't say anything. I just burped a tank today I was burping a tank that like you would dry hopping, but instead it was just it was like 200 pounds of walnuts that I roasted at another brewery. Put into the tank just to try to get like a baked good vanilla imperial stout thing out of.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
The beauty about walnuts is that they add a beautiful character to the mouthfeel of a beer. So, I mean, that's always good. So, you didn't sell your soul all the way.
That's
What do
right.
they do? What do they do for head retention though? That's the question.
And
Yeah, you're roasting them.
Yeah, the oil doesn't evaporate.
Yeah, it's gonna dissolve.
just carb it to 3.0 and then
So the new if you like minting money is how many sacks of lactose you can put in your beer. So
No.
Yeah. When you stop making money because of how many pounds of hops you put in something, then you will start minting money because you can put more lactose in your beer than anyone else.
I think it's lactose and vanilla. But I'll also state that it's very soft. I mean, we buy it by the 55-gallon drum.
We've never actually added lactose to a beer here.
Good, don't
Good
do
for
that
you.
ever.
Good,
Don't,
hell
don't
yeah.
do that.
I honestly,
High five.
yeah, I honestly think, like I don't eat or dairy or anything anyways, but I just think you can build in sweetness into your recipe.
Yes.
You can do things in your process to kind of get that flavor that I don't think you need to do that. And there's other, it's just like unfermentable sugars. It's an unfermentable sugar. Like you can get it from mashing hot or what your grist is comprised of. And honestly, like there's just a lot of people that are very sensitive. Like my brother, for example, can't have lactose, and so it's a little frustrating when you don't know if a beer has it or not, and you have to look on Untapped, and even then you can't tell if it's in there or not. And so we just stay away from it altogether.
But I will say that
Good for you.
BBP does a great job of making sure that people know if it has or has not, if lactose has been added. I will say, like,
but they all have lactose, so it's really hard to
it's
that
on
hard.
the door when
The
you
answer
walk
is
in.
yes for everything.
You just say when it doesn't.
Yeah, it's assumed. It's assumed.
What's funny about that? We joke. We're like, if the question wasn't when I would make a seltzer, the question is when we add lactose to it. But no, I think it all comes from. It's always like a trade-off. I think that you're right that you could get the same character at the same way, but sometimes I think there are certain instances, very small. I mean, I always like to refer back to a milk stout. Like, why would it be its own thing if you could just do that with not lactose? So that there is a small
time and place, like
well,
everything.
I mean,
I will say,
there's one style. It's called milk stout. That's the time and place.
I would agree.
I mean,
I think
lactose isn't going to hop creep, so there is that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can always save a beer with lactose, right? If you screwed up.
No, you don't add lactose on the cold side, man. It doesn't. I mean, I don't know. No, I think.
I always know when lactose is in the beer. So if it's that identifiable, then perhaps there are people that like that.
Yeah,
but I'm not one of them.
I think people do like that, but like a big thing is like barrel aged beers. Like there's, a lot of people that put lactose barrel aged beers or lactose beers into barrels, and for me, I get like very cheesy character when it's been there a long. But I think what a lot of people don't think about is using maltodextrin instead, because it keeps you need that thick base when you're adding all those tannins and the extra alcohol. Well, I agree. I mean, it's definitely a cheap trick, know.
I mean, whether it's maltodextrin or lactose, you put that shit in my barrel, the Brett will eat it.
Yeah. Well, like a bourbon barrel. Send the dogs.
Yeah, send the dogs. It will devour everything.
You'd be surprised, I think, how much maltodextrin is going into some of the imperial stouts that you buy now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
When imperial stouts from other breweries, luckily, like beer just shows up here, which is kind of awesome. But usually when we taste it, we also like dig acid and take gravity and pH readings and stuff like that, just to see if everyone
get out the easy dens. And
of course,
you play that game.
An imperial stout final gravity here it was 1090, so it was 1090.
What?
Final graph.
That is
What-
like
what
40
is-
points
that's it.
more than every beer that I make.
And it was literally 3% Russian Imperial Stout,
Out.
3% ABV. They started
Jesus.
they started at 1100
I would-
and it fermented to 1090.
What I don't
It
get
was
about
as many
know what beer
calories as
that
like
was.
a Big Mac and a half.
what I don't get about that
Much
is-
more decadent though.
is- well, I don't know about that.
But
But,
people like it, so I mean,
Yeah, that's people love sugar.
yeah.
I mean, I know like the
Copyright infringement, Big Mac and a half. That's a good beer name right there.
that's it, man. It's I mean, hey, you either check the pastry box or you check the IP theft box.
Yeah,
You do them both, gold mine.
that's how you
Goldmine.
print money, and then give
That's
it-
how you print money. Rip off IP just close enough you don't get sued.
We have a lot of opinions in this group, apparently. But
Yeah,
yeah,
spell it like, BIGMAK, big.
Oh yeah.
Satire. You're fine.
but I
So-
yeah,
Or, McDonald's, right? Yeah.
So Scott, knowing you're a Lambic and Goose fan, what is your best or most enjoyable Lambic or Goose drinking experience? What has been your favorite beer of that world? If you had to
favorite
choose
beer
one.
and stuff. I'd say anything by Dree. I love Drake so much. Like any goose I can get from them, I'm gonna like. I'm a sucker for anything that has wine grapes in it too. Trying to think of the last one that was in here. Or I'm trying to think of U.S. based ones, but the Guard in the U.S. I think is probably one of my favorites in terms of consistently putting out pretty good beer.
Criminally underrated, in my opinion. They do not get the fanfare that I think they deserve, and they've been doing it before that shit was cool here.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah, they're great. Well, I'll have to send you one of my. I got one of my barrel beers on grape must. It's a Alicante Grenache and Merlot must. I get my barrels from this old Italian dude close here in Jersey. He just runs wine through them, only uses them 3 years, and then sells them to me. So I've been every year for the last 3 years taking his spent barrels. And this year he gave me like 30 pounds of must, and I got some barrel beer on one of those to see what it's like. I've literally been tasting it like every week just to not get too many tannins from the seeds, because there's no way in hell you could pick the seeds out. I tried. After 45 minutes, I was just like, no, I'm not doing this.
You're gonna pull the nail so many times when it comes time to emptying it, it's already empty.
No, I got it on I got them in some for Monster fermenters.
Nice.
So yeah, recent pull. I'm doing kind of like a little the full Lara approach. So I'm only pulling like 10, 15 gallons at a time. This one's now on, it's like probably about average age, probably about 20 months total for the beer that's in there based on whatever crude math I did. But yeah, it's tasting pretty nice. I'll have to send a bottle down to you.
That'd be awesome.
Let me know what you think.
I'll send it with the
Yeah.
preference, so.
Yeah, for sure. So one other cool thing I wanted to know. So we had a guest a couple months ago from who worked at Admiral Malts, kind of going down into like the whole realm of how they do specifically floor malted varieties and kind of the old process. Have you guys played around anything with floor malted malts specifically?
Floor malted Bohemian Pills stuff I think we've done. But nothing that comes right to mind in terms of having like a big implication on the beer. But
I'll jump on the bandwagon. It's great.
and I'll be honest that like I'm not a huge malt guy. I don't spend a lot of time researching, learning about malts. I pretty much rely entirely on Mike for that. He's big into that. He's got 20 years of brewing different beers, and we look at most of his old recipes and we're putting together our new ones. I've pretty much been obsessed with brewing like hoppy IPAs and like lambic style beers and saisons, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And none of those beers, none of those styles have any malts, really like anything that's just like pale or flaked or whatever. And so it's one area I almost get embarrassed when I get asked about, because I just I don't have a lot of good answers for people when it comes to different malts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of with you there. Like, I never really put too much credence into malt specifically until about the last year, and I have for the most part started using floor malted Bohemian Pilsner in place of just regular Pilsner, and I do see a difference in character, definitely a difference in foam stability and in yeast health too, and some character. And like, there's some of our previous guests who've been picking up things here and there about, like last month we had Richard from Escarpment Labs talking yeast, and he was talking pretty heavily about fan content in malt and how much that has an impact on the yeast vitality and the yeast health, which then of course can then contribute to how does yeast process the hops and all the other compounds in, and how like every piece is so integral to what that final experience looks like, and each one can impact it in so many different ways. So like, I had never really thought about malt too much, kind of always concentrated on the bugs, the yeast, the hops, and as the last year started looking more into it, and I like starting to see some of these correlations, I think, between some of the character and the ultimate the end experience that comes out of it, which I think is pretty cool to see and try to put in practice.
Yeah, no, I agree. It definitely can have an impact. And I think a lot of like the, palish style beers, especially if they're heavily hopped or they get, Brett and PDO, and there's a lot of stuff going on. I think it's harder to maybe tell those subtle changes with just pale malts. Maybe it has more of an impact on some of the, ones that are a little more roasted or something. The one area I've been looking at in terms of malt is like the 3MH precursor in malt in terms of hoppy beers. Malt itself can have 3MH precursors, which can actually increase during the boil, and that's where some of those strains that can bioconvert are super interesting to me with malt strains. But again, I'm looking at malt in terms of fruity flavors, and not really grain flavors. I'm really sensitive to the taste of malts, and like we'll add a little bit of like toasted oats or something in a pale ale, and like it's all I get on the finish. People like it. It's just not a thing that I really care for, and it's almost like a competing factor when it comes to like hop flavors to me. But I think I might be alone in that opinion. But when it comes to like malty beers, I really enjoy some of our like Flander Red style beers, where that's where I like Brett and like red caramelly malts to me works really well with like sour barrel aged thing. Adding those set with like fruit or something down the line, that's where I like malt. But when it comes to just like pale beers, I typically are like, there's just a little bit in there. Like Munich malt, for example, that's just one of those malts. If it's just like 5 or 10, 5% in a pale ale or something, it's like, ugh, is there Munich in this thing? It's just.
And you guys have made some like pretty big ABV Flanders, right? I mean, I think I forgot which homebrew club in Jersey you spoke to like around this time last year. I think it was the Pale Ales. I think it was. Yeah. Well, I watched there, and you had mentioned that you had some big 10-11% Flanders guys that you'd like to pull out on a Saturday night if the feeling's right.
Well, it's the fun thing about those is like your base beer doesn't have to be very big to get a big high ABV sour beer when it completely dries out.
That is true. Like I said, all my beers are pretty much 1050 and under, and I'm still making 6%ers, 6.5%ers because there's nothing left.
Yeah. In fact, we had to almost purposely make some lower starting gravity beers for our second year, just because I think we didn't have enough variation in some of our barrel aged sour beers. They're all starting to be like 7-8%. But it almost just seems goofy. You're making like a 1040 beer. It's like hardly any of the grain you're used to using.
Yeah, I mean, like one's absolute might get down to 998, so might as well pad a little bit.
Well, and then when you're going into, we usually ferment in stainless, and so you get 1040 beer down to 1010. It's like there's nothing there.
Yeah.
And then you go into barrels, and then of course it pretty much dries out depending on which culture is in those barrels. But
yeah, do you do any fermentation in the barrel itself?
We don't. We might consider doing that now that we are moving into a new space for sour beers. That will actually have its own trench drain and stuff. But for us, it would have just been too much of a risk to have any fermenting sour beer coming out of barrels next to close to proximity of all of our clean stuff. So we just didn't even try it. And I know that a lot of lambic beers were traditionally, or I believe traditionally, fermented in barrels, and that's just not something we've done because you'd have a lot of losses, and I suppose you just have to top up those barrels, but can be done.
Yeah, too risky in a business for sure.
Yeah, I think the mobile canning line company would probably ban us if they knew there was.
Oh yeah, Ironheart's very strong.
If they knew there was Brett floating, they probably already know there's Brett floating around here, but.
Yeah, oh, it's everywhere.
Out of tanks, I think they'd be or barrels. I think they'd say, "Yep, see ya."
Oh, that's you got to start canning some weird beers.
Ironheart won't let you.
That's all right. Get out that single canner.
I think Ironheart deals with some real out there, fermentation stuff.
I wonder, do you know who Referend used for their cannings?
I thought it was Tripod, but could be wrong.
Did they can mixed firm beers that were still like alive? They didn't pasteurize or anything?
So
they did a collab with Tonewood.
Yeah, well, they've done a bunch of canned mixed fermentation beers. I mean, they're all spontaneous beers. I mean, they're all obviously dried out to nothing. But the cans I have, which is the last run they did, probably a year and a half old. The cans are super firm. Like they are clearly there has been additional activity going on. Like I don't think they're going to explode. Like it's not like it's like like it's one of these slushy beers, but like it's hard as a rock.
I mean, if you have your own canning line and it's dedicated to only sour stuff, and your beer is pretty much at final gravity, and you're not introducing any new bugs. But that's the risk is even though you're like, let's say you're taking beer from a barrel that's finished at 10:05 or something like that, and it's been there for 2 years, and you can it. Well, what if one of those previous beers that you went through that had bacteria that was finishing stuff out below 1 was still in one of those tubes or still alive?
Oh yeah,
it's going to go to work eventually, probably.
Yeah, with enough time for sure.
So even if you're confident that beer is stable, it still seems kind of risky, but I mean that's just kind of the price you play. And honestly, we do that in bottles anyways. I mean, you're still playing that game in bottles, but
I mean, like my standard has been nothing, at least anything with Brett gets bottled higher than 1004. Like that's like if I 3, 4, 5 months at that stable 1004, 3, 2, whatever, cool, I'll throw it in a bottle. But until it gets down to 1004, because it eventually will, I do not even consider bottling it up.
Yeah, we still have some barrels that are 1010, 1012 that have been in barrels for 2 years now that are been there this whole time, but we have a hard time putting them into blends with anything because that's just too many fermentable sugars that those other barrels would just go to town on, and unless you have another vessel to put them in and hang out for 6 months. But
what if you just back blended it in enough for that to be your bottle or your carbonation for your conditioning?
You certainly could. It's just I wouldn't trust myself to do that math.
Yeah, that is true. That is very true.
Well, I think I'm gonna bail on you guys here.
Cool, man. This long. This was awesome.
It was a long half a beer.
Yeah. This is how they typically go, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scott, dude, thank you so much again for taking some time out and chatting with us and sharing some knowledge. Like I said, you've been a phenomenal resource to myself and so many homebrewers in the space. You and Michael as well. So wish you the best. Happy to see things are going well for you guys down at Sapwood. Excited to get down there whenever this stuff blows over. We're able to. Maybe we'll do a little caravan of sorts of the club. But thanks again for sharing some time and just sharing some awesome information. Definitely put in practice. But yeah, man, definitely wish you well. best of luck with everything, and hopefully we can cross paths soon. I'll bring some lambic down your way to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring some of those some wine grape beers down my way. That's
Oh, you got it, man. Yeah, I'll make Googer come with me too. I'll get him in the car.
Sounds good. But I'm happy to do it, and thanks for the invite, and hopefully I didn't bore you too much.
No, absolutely not.
No,
Appreciate
it's
your
great.
time, man.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Yeah, Scott.
Thanks,
This was
Scott.
awesome. Thank you very much.
Take it easy, man. Be well.
Cheers.
Take it easy.
Thanks, Scott. Take care, man.